The city's most powerful men and women had gathered beneath crystal chandeliers for the most exclusive night of the year. At the entrance, a single father in a worn button-down shirt and scuffed shoes stood quietly as a security guard blocked his path, denied entry in front of everyone who mattered. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. For 12 long minutes, Wyatt Carter simply waited outside while the crowd inside laughed, clinked glasses, and never once looked twice at the man on the other side of the door. They would spend the rest of the evening trying to forget that they had. Stay until the very end to witness the moment an entire room fell silent before a truth no one saw coming. Wyatt Carter was 27 years old and had already learned the particular discipline of invisibility. He knew how to move through a building without being noticed, which stairwells were camera blind spots, which hallways echoed, which ventilation panels hummed at a slightly wrong pitch that indicated a loose bracket somewhere upstream. He had spent the past 14 months working the overnight maintenance shift at Callaway Corporate Center, arriving at 10 in the evening and leaving before the first office lights blinked on. In that half-lit world of empty corridors and cooling servers, he had become something close to a ghost. That suited him fine. Ghosts didn't have to explain themselves. He lived in a second-floor apartment on Redfield Street. The kind of building where the boiler was unreliable in February and the ceiling fan rattled if you left it above the second speed. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, one barely large enough to hold a twin mattress, and a small dresser painted the color of a summer sky, and that smaller room belonged to Mason, 6 years old, dark eyes that noticed everything. A boy who collected small toy cars and lined them along the windowsill in an order that meant something only to him, and who had recently begun asking questions that Wyatt could not always answer honestly. Mason was the reason Wyatt had left his previous life. Mason was the reason he had taken the night job, and Mason, most mornings, was the first sound Wyatt heard when he came home. Small feet crossing the floor, the bedroom door opening, and a child's voice still rough with sleep, asking if he had eaten anything, as if the boy understood, even at 6, that certain adults needed to be watched over. Wyatt cooked breakfast before he slept. Scrambled eggs, always. Sometimes toast if the bread hadn't gone stale. He would sit at the kitchen table while Mason ate and watch the way the light came through the window and fell across the boy's face, and in those quiet minutes it was difficult to remember exactly how much had been lost and exactly how much had been kept. 3 weeks before the gala, a plain white envelope had appeared in Wyatt's work locker. No postage, no return address. Inside was a single card-heavy stock, embossed logo of Nexarion Technologies at the top, and a printed line that read, "You are cordially invited to attend the Nexarion Annual Leadership Gala," and below that, typed in a smaller font, "Your presence is requested." No formal name filled the guest line, no table number, just those 2 sentences and a date. He had held the card for a long time, turning it over in his hands. Then he had slipped it back into the envelope and gone home to make breakfast. But the date had stayed with him. Nexarion Technologies. He knew that name the way a man knows the address of a house he grew up in and no longer enters. He had known it for 3 years. He had built things inside it, architecturally invisible things, the kind of structural work that no one celebrates because no one sees it until it fails. And then, 18 months ago, he had walked away, or been pushed. The distinction had blurred in the time since. The night of the gala, Mason was at his grandmother's house across town. Wyatt had kissed the top of the boy's head and told him to be good, and Mason had looked up at him with that particular gaze, alert and measuring, and asked where he was going. Wyatt had said, "Just to check on something." Mason had considered this, then handed him one of the small toy cars from his collection, a silver one, slightly dented on the roof. "For luck," the boy said, in a tone that was wholly serious. Wyatt had put it in his shirt pocket. He drove to the Meridian Grand Hotel and found a parking space 3 blocks away because the valet line stretched half around the building. He sat in the car for 4 minutes without moving. Then he got out and walked toward the light. The Meridian Grand had been built in an era when architectural ambition and money arrived simultaneously, and no one thought to ask either of them to be quiet. Its facade rose 12 stories in pale stone and arched glass, and on this particular Friday evening in late October, every window on the ballroom level blazed gold against the dark sky. A red carpet ran from the curb to the entrance. Men in black ties clustered at the base of the steps. Women in floor-length gowns passed through the glass doors as though the evening had been designed specifically to contain them. Nexarian Technologies was the kind of company that had learned to perform success as fluently as it pursued it. Founded 8 years ago, in a rented office above a dry cleaner on 4th Street, it had grown into one of the fastest-moving enterprise software firms in the region. Its CEO was 26 years old, which was a fact that publications mentioned constantly, and she herself never did. Eleanor Hayes had the bearing of someone who had long ago decided that the fastest way through a room was a straight line. And she moved that way always. No deviation, no pleasantry that wasn't purposeful. Tonight she stood near the center of the ballroom, receiving introductions she didn't need, and remembering names she already knew. She wore navy blue. Her hair was pulled back. At her shoulder, within comfortable speaking distance, stood Dominic Blake, Chief Operating Officer, 41 years old, the kind of man who arrived at the right answers through an exhausting process of making himself the most important person in every conversation. Dominic had orchestrated much of tonight's program. He had selected the catering, approved the guest list, and chosen the presentation order for the evening's data, showcase a live financial projection sequence that would run on the main screens behind the stage, while Eleanor addressed 240 guests. He had been meticulous about every detail. He was a man who understood that control was most powerful when it appeared natural. Wyatt reached the entrance at 8:17, which was late enough that the flow of arriving guests had thinned to a trickle. The 2 security guards at the door were young and broad-shouldered, and had the practiced stillness of men who had learned that stillness communicated authority more efficiently than movement. One of them stepped forward as Wyatt approached the carpet. "Invitation," the guard said. Not a question. Wyatt reached into his jacket pocket and produced the white envelope. The guard opened it, scanned the card, and his expression did not change, but something behind his eyes performed a small recalibration. He looked at Wyatt's shirt, a plain blue button-down, clean but visibly old, the collar slightly softened from too many washes. He looked at the shoes. He looked back at the card. "There's no name on this," the guard said. "I know," Wyatt said. "I need a registered name to confirm your entry." "This isn't sufficient." The guard handed the card back with the particular finality of someone who has decided and does not anticipate revision. A small cluster of guests who had been waiting behind Wyatt shifted and murmured. One of the women in the group, silver-haired, in a white gown, the kind of person who had perfected the art of dismissing without appearing to look, said something quietly to her companion. Her companion laughed. Wyatt heard it. He kept his face neutral. "If you'll step to the side, sir. You're blocking the entrance." A man behind the first guard moved forward, older, with the deliberate cadence of a supervisor who has handled these moments before. He glanced at the envelope in Wyatt's hand, and then at Wyatt himself. And his assessment was brief and final. "This event is by confirmed guest list only. I'm going to have to ask you to move on." From somewhere near the entrance a voice drifted out, light, social, the specific register of a joke landing well among people who are already disposed to laugh. Crystal clinked. The doors breathed open briefly as a pair of guests pushed through from inside. And for just a moment the warmth and light of the ballroom spilled outward and was gone. Wyatt stood exactly where he was. He did not argue. He did not produce any further documentation or offer any explanation. He simply looked through the glass doors at the space beyond the long tables, the screens at the far end of the room running preliminary graphics, the slow drift of formally dressed people between the conversation clusters, and his expression was that of a man reading something in a language he helped invent. "Sir." The supervisor's voice had developed an edge. "I won't ask again." Wyatt took one step back from the carpet. Just one. He stood on the sidewalk and put his hands in his pockets and watched the doors. The silver car from Mason's collection pressed gently against his sternum from the breast pocket. He let it. The crowd at the base of the steps had thinned, but the ones remaining had noticed. The woman in the white gown had positioned herself at a slight angle that suggested she was not watching while ensuring she missed nothing. A younger man near the valet podium had his chin lifted in the particular way that people lift their chins when they want to confirm they are not part of something without entirely looking away from it. None of them spoke to Wyatt. He had been in rooms where silence was a verdict before. He understood its grammar, the way it pressed from all sides at once, the way it required a person to either shrink into it or to simply exist in it without apology. He had learned, over the past 3 years, to choose the second option. It was not always easy. Tonight, it was easier than he expected. Inside his chest, beneath the ordinary surface of the evening, something older was moving. He remembered the first time he had walked into a Nexarian office, not through a service entrance, not at 10 at night, but through the front door. Early in the morning, 24 years old and carrying a laptop bag and a notebook full of diagrams. He had been hired as a systems architect. The title had felt enormous then, had felt like proof of something he had worked toward since he was 17, and had taught himself network protocols from library books, because his high school didn't offer the course. He had built things at Nexarian, real things, the data integration layer that connected the company's client-facing dashboard to its back-end financial engine. That was his. The load distribution protocol that kept the system from collapsing during peak reporting periods, that was his too, down to the error handling sequences that nobody had ever had reason to test in a live environment. He had written 314 pages of technical documentation in 2 years and annotated every line. He had been 26 when he left. He had not left voluntarily, but the paperwork had been arranged to suggest otherwise, and he had signed it because his son was 4 months old at the time, and his wife had just been diagnosed with something that would require every hour of his attention that was not already spoken for. He had needed to exit quietly. Dominic Blake had understood this and had used it without hesitation. The exit agreement contained language about confidentiality, about intellectual property, about the conditions under which Wyatt could discuss his work at Nexarian. It did not prevent him from attending a gala. It did not address that. He suspected the invitation had not come from Dominic. He suspected Dominic did not know the invitation existed. He was checking his watch 8:31 when the doors opened and a young woman appeared in the gap. She was perhaps 23, in a formal company lanyard over a blazer, carrying a tablet. She scanned the entrance area quickly. Then her eyes found Wyatt on the sidewalk, and for a brief fraction of a second, her expression changed in a way that was not uncertainty but recognition. She took one step toward him, then a hand appeared at her elbow. Dominic Blake, moving through the entrance crowd with the fluid efficiency of a man who monitors more than he appears to, and said something close to her ear. The young woman's face went careful and still. She looked once more at Wyatt, then turned back inside. The doors closed. Wyatt watched this without expression. He reached into his shirt pocket, not for the silver car, but for the other thing he had carried tonight, a small key card, plain white, with a single printed code across its face. He turned it once in his fingers. Then he put it back. Not yet. The young woman's name was Claire Nguyen, and she had joined Nexarian as a junior systems coordinator 11 months ago, which was 13 months after Wyatt had been quietly removed from the company's organizational chart. She had never met him in person, but she had spent the past 7 months living inside the documentation he had left behind, the annotated architecture files that no one had properly credited, the integration protocols filed under a generic project alias, the 314 pages that the senior engineering team referenced constantly and attributed only to a period in the company's early development. She had found his name in a changelog 6 months ago, buried in a folder 3 levels deep in the internal archive. A single metadata line. Primary author W. Carter. She had said nothing to anyone about this, but she had started paying attention to the shape of what he had built, the way certain decisions were made before anyone else in the room had understood the problem clearly enough to make them, and she had begun to understand that someone had been very deliberate about erasing a very particular kind of credit. When Dominic had pulled her back inside tonight, he had said, with the measured calmness of someone issuing an instruction they expect to be obeyed without inquiry, "That man is not on the guest list. Don't engage." And then he had smiled in the way that he deployed smiles as confirmation that the conversation was over. Claire had returned to her station at the technical coordination desk near the stage. On her tablet's side panel, a small notification light was pulsing. She dismissed it without reading it. On the screen where the presentation sequence was queued, the live data module was showing green across all checkpoints. She studied it for a moment longer than she needed to, then looked toward the ballroom doors. Outside, Wyatt's phone had vibrated in his pocket 3 times since he arrived. He had not answered. The number was an internal Nexarian line, one of the legacy lines that had been in the company's phone infrastructure since the early days, when the exchange was smaller and the numbers were shorter. He had recognized it immediately. He stood on the sidewalk and watched the hotel entrance and let the city move around him. Taxis. A couple walking past arm in arm. arguing softly about something that sounded important to them and would probably not be important tomorrow. The faint bass of the ballroom music, muffled behind glass and stone and distance. At 8:49, the ballroom's ambient sound changed. Not dramatically, not in any way a person outside would have registered. But Wyatt had spent years listening to systems, and he heard the difference between the low-sustained hum of electronics performing correctly and the particular frequency that follows when something critical has stopped being correct. It was the sound of a threshold crossed. He straightened slightly. His hand moved toward his pocket. Then the doors burst open, not from a departing guest but from a young engineer in a company badge and an expression that had left composed somewhere on the other side of the evening, and Wyatt heard, clearly across the cold air between them, the words, "The projection system is down. We can't recover the financial feed." Inside the Meridian Grand Ballroom, the evening had fractured. 240 guests had arrived at their seats for the formal presentation segment of the program, the showcase that Dominic had positioned as the centerpiece of the night, the moment when Nexarian's 5-year financial trajectory would be displayed in animated real-time graphics across the twin screens flanking the main stage. It was meant to be impressive. The software that powered it was, in fact, genuinely impressive. A live feed integration that pulled from 3 separate data sources simultaneously and rendered them into a unified display with sub-second latency. Wyatt had written the original framework that made that possible. A later team had built the visual interface on top of it without, apparently, reading his latency failsafe documentation carefully enough. The screens had gone dark at 8:51. Not black, something more specific than that. A cascade of frozen frames, each one offset by 3 seconds from the last. So the display showed the same graph fragmented across 4 ghost images, overlapping and contradicting each other. The audio sync had also dropped, leaving the stage speakers emitting a low, irregular tone that made people near the front row shift uncomfortably in their seats. Eleanor Hayes was standing at the podium when it happened. She had been mid-sentence, something about compound growth and sustained investment, and she had paused and looked at the screens the way someone looks at a door that has just opened unexpectedly. For exactly 2 seconds she held still. Then she turned to the wings and made eye contact with the event coordinator, whose face confirmed that no, this was not part of the program. 3 engineers from the AV team converged on the stage-side technical station. They were competent men who understood event production systems and had set up this display without issue during the afternoon sound check. What they did not understand, what no one currently standing in that ballroom understood, was that the problem was not in the visual hardware, or the AV routing, or the HDMI signal chain. It was 3 levels deeper. It was inside the data integration layer itself, in a fallback sequence that had been triggered by a timestamp conflict between 2 of the source feeds, a conflict that could only occur under one specific condition that the technical documentation had described in careful detail and that nobody had apparently read. Dominic Blake reached the technical station at 8:53 and immediately began issuing instructions. He was not an engineer, but he was a man who understood that confidence in a crisis served a social function, independent of whether the confident person knew what they were doing. He told the AV team to restart the renderer. They did. Nothing changed. He told them to bypass the live feed and switch to a static backup. They attempted it. The screens produced a brief flash of the backup slide, then returned to the fragmented cascade. Eleanor had left the podium and was now standing at the edge of the stage, speaking in low tones to her assistant. Her voice was controlled, which required effort. She had worked for 6 years to build the architecture of this company's reputation, and tonight was meant to consolidate it to demonstrate to the investors and partners seated at those tables that Nexarian was not merely growing, but was growing correctly. Systematically, with intention, and the screens behind her were showing a malfunctioning cascade of broken data, like a crack run through the wall of a building that was supposed to be solid. Someone in the audience laughed, not cruelly, or perhaps a little cruelly, the kind of laugh that escapes when discomfort needs somewhere to go. A table near the back began a murmured side conversation. The room's temperature, socially speaking, had dropped several degrees. At the technical station, one of the engineers pulled up the system log and stared at it with the expression of a person reading a text in a language they half know. He could see where the error was. He could not understand why it was there, or what the correct path out of it looked like. The documentation, he would say later, was not the version currently filed in the company archive. It was an older version, a more complete version, and no one in the room had access to it. No one in the room. The engineer who had burst through the doors, his name was Trevor, 24, 8 months with the company, was still standing on the entrance steps, trying to get a signal on his phone when the man on the sidewalk walked past him. Not past him exactly. Through the gap between him and the doorframe, with the precise ease of someone who has calculated the geometry of available space and committed to moving through it before anyone has had the opportunity to object. The security guard at the door turned, opened his mouth, took a half step forward. Wyatt was already inside. He walked through the lobby without slowing. He was oriented, had been oriented since before he arrived, from memory and from the floor plan that had not meaningfully changed in 3 years because the Meridian Grand's ballroom level had not been renovated in that time. He crossed the lobby, turned left at the coat check, went through the service corridor door that required a key card with the right access level, and used his. The technical station was stage right, behind a black curtain screen, at a 45-degree angle to the main screens. He stepped through the gap in the curtain and stopped 2 feet from the nearest AV engineer, who looked up with the expression of a man who has been surprised, but cannot currently afford to process it. "Show me the system log," Wyatt said. The engineer stared at him. Dominic Blake turned from the other side of the station, and something moved through his face, a recognition that preceded understanding, and then the understanding, and then something that was not quite alarm but was close to it. "Who let you in here?" Dominic said. Not a question. Wyatt was already at the keyboard. "The log," he said again. To the engineer. And not to Dominic. The engineer, operating on some instinct that defaulted to whoever seemed most certain, turned the screen toward him. Wyatt read for 11 seconds. No one spoke. The irregular tone from the stage speakers continued its low, uncomfortable pulse. Then Wyatt straightened, typed 4 lines into the command terminal, waited 3 seconds, typed 2 more. On the main screens, visible even from behind the curtain through the gap at its edge, the cascade of frozen frames collapsed into black. Then, cleanly and completely, the correct display came back, the financial timeline, animated, synced, running exactly as it had been designed to run, as if the preceding 7 minutes had been a brief, rude interruption to something that was always going to work. There was a sound from the ballroom, not loud. More like the collective exhale of 240 people who had been holding tension in their shoulders without knowing it. Dominic said, "You don't have clearance to be here." The timestamp conflict was in the fallback handler, Wyatt said, still to the engineer and not to Dominic. "There's a known issue when both source feeds push an update within the same 3-second window during a live render. The failsafe trips instead of queuing. The fix is in the original documentation, Section 9, page 207. You should have that memorized before your next live event." The engineer nodded slowly. He looked like a man receiving information he would be thinking about for days. Then Eleanor Hayes came through the curtain. She had heard the screens recover from the stage, had turned, had seen the display correct itself, and had followed the most direct line to its cause, which was, as always, her instinct. She stopped when she saw Wyatt. Her face was unreadable in the specific way that very controlled people's faces become unreadable when something has surprised them deeply. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know who you are." The silence behind the curtain was different from the silence outside on the sidewalk. That one had been ambient, incidental, the silence of indifference. This one had weight. It pressed against the air between Wyatt and Eleanor and Dominic and the 2 engineers who had gone very still, aware that something was shifting in the room that was above their pay grade and possibly above everyone's. Eleanor Hayes had not come to lead Nexarian by being slow to connect information. She had reviewed the company's foundational architecture twice in the past year, once when a client had raised questions about the integration system's scalability, and once when she had begun to notice that the technical team's answers about the system's original design were consistently vague in a way that felt like a structural gap rather than a knowledge gap. She had asked Dominic, on both occasions, to produce the primary authorship records. On both occasions, the documentation had come back attributed to a team effort during the company's early development phase. She had found this unsatisfying but had not yet found the lever. "Wyatt Carter," she said. The name was not a guess. She had found it 3 weeks ago in an archive folder that Claire had quietly flagged in the internal system, a flag small enough to appear accidental, deliberate enough to be found by someone looking. Eleanor had been looking. Wyatt held her gaze. "Yes, you built the integration layer." The load protocol. The fail-safe system. She said it the way she said things she had confirmed. Not as a question, but as an inventory. The original versions, he said. Yes. Dominic moved. Not dramatically, he was too composed for dramatics, but he moved to a position slightly between them. Slightly forward. With the body language of a man placing himself in a conversation so that he can steer it. Wyatt left the company under a mutual separation agreement. His contributions were accounted for in the terms of that agreement, and the intellectual property was formally transferred at that time. There is nothing here that requires. The separation agreement did not require you to remove his name from the internal documentation, Eleanor said. Her voice was exactly the same temperature it had been before. That was the part that made Dominic go quiet. That was a choice. Made separately, Dominic said nothing. I've been trying to locate the primary author of the foundational architecture for 8 months, Eleanor said. She was still looking at Wyatt. I was told there was no single author, that it was built iteratively by several people. That's partially accurate, Wyatt said. Several people refined it. I built the core. The 314 pages in the original documentation file have my name in every changelog. The version currently in the company archive has been edited. He paused. You can check the file creation timestamps. They don't match the modification dates. Someone went in after the original was filed. In the 11 seconds that followed, Dominic Blake's career at Nexarion ended not with anything dramatic, not with a confrontation or an accusation, but with the specific stillness of a person who has run out of plausible narrative and knows it. Eleanor did not look at him. She kept her gaze on Wyatt. Why did you come tonight? She asked. He considered this. I got an invitation. And I wanted to see if it still worked. He meant the system. He may have meant something else as well. He did not clarify. Through the gap in the curtain, the ballroom was still recovering its social equilibrium. Guests had returned to conversation. The screens ran cleanly. No one on the other side of the curtain yet understood what had just happened in the space behind it, but the evening had shifted its weight in a way that 240 people would sense without being able to name. Eleanor excused the 2 engineers with a look. They left with the grateful speed of people who have been present for something they did not entirely witness. The 3 of them, Eleanor, Wyatt, Dominic, stood in the technical enclosure, and the air between them organized itself into the shape of a reckoning that had been waiting 18 months for a room. Dominic spoke first, because Dominic always spoke when he was losing ground, on the theory that words were a way of holding it. The intellectual property transfer was legal and documented. His work was compensated. Everything else is a matter of internal file management that I can explain to any. Dominic, Eleanor said. Just the name. He stopped. She turned to Wyatt. Tell me what you want. And here was the thing that Wyatt had not entirely prepared for, not because he lacked an answer, but because the question, from her, carried a weight of genuine intent that he had not expected tonight. He had arrived to see if the system still worked. He had not arrived expecting to be asked what he wanted by the one person in the building who could actually deliver it. He thought about it honestly. Credit, he said. Formal attribution in the company record. Public acknowledgement. If you go forward with any patent applications that use architecture I designed, my son is 6 years old. When he's old enough to understand what I did here, I want there to be a record he can find. He paused. That's all. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Dominic in a way that was a conclusion rather than a question. And Dominic, who had read rooms professionally for 20 years, understood that he was reading this one correctly, and that it did not contain any version of the next morning where he still held the title he had held this morning. We'll need your formal review of the documentation, Eleanor said to Wyatt. Not tonight. But I'd like to begin that process. I'll think about it, Wyatt said. She nodded. It was not the answer she wanted, but she accepted it the way she accepted most things she could not immediately resolve, by filing it in the correct place and returning to it with more information. Dominic left the technical enclosure quietly, which was the only option available to him, and the sound of his departure was the sound of a lock disengaging from the inside of a room that someone had just vacated permanently. Wyatt walked back through the ballroom. And this time, no one stopped him. He moved through the tables with the same unhurried economy he used to move through empty hallways at midnight, and people stepped aside without entirely knowing why, responding to some quality in his bearing that communicated a kind of settled authority, the kind that doesn't need a title on a lanyard to be real. He was almost at the exit when his phone rang. He answered it. "Daddy." Mason's voice, high and clear and utterly alert in the way that 6-year-olds are alert at 10 in the evening when they are supposed to be asleep at their grandmother's house. "Grandma said you would come get me." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Wyatt said. "Are you okay?" Mason asked. Seriously. Wyatt pushed through the glass doors into the cool October air. The entrance was nearly empty now. The late evening crowd had moved inside hours ago, and the red carpet was beginning to look slightly forlorn, as formal things do when the occasion has moved past them. He stood on the steps and looked out at the lit street and the ordinary darkness beyond it. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay. Did you check on the thing?" "I checked on the thing. Was it okay?" He reached into his breast pocket and found the small silver car, slightly dented on its roof. Held it lightly in his palm. "It was okay," he said. "Come on. Get your shoes." He was at the bottom of the steps when the doors opened behind him and Eleanor Hayes came out. She stopped when she saw him on the sidewalk, and there was a moment of simple coincidence. Two people finding themselves in the same outdoor air after an evening of pressure and performance and revelation, and neither of them spoke for a second. Then Eleanor said, "I'm sorry about the door." Earlier, it was an unusual thing for her to say. He understood that. People with her particular authority rarely offered apologies for the actions of their organization, because doing so required acknowledging that the organization had failed in a way they could not account for. That she said it anyway, plainly, without qualification, told him something about the quality of her attention. "It wasn't your call," he said. "It was my building," she said. "My event. My people." He considered that. Then he nodded once, the kind of nod that accepts something without making it larger than it needs to be. He put the silver car back in his pocket and started walking toward the parking garage, 3 blocks north. Behind him, through the glass, the ballroom was still full of light. The screens were running perfectly. 240 people were finishing their evenings in the warm certainty that everything had gone exactly as planned. He thought about the offer on the drive to his mother's house. Eleanor's voice in that steady, direct register, "I'd like to begin that process," and what it implied. A return? A re-entry? A correction of the record that would require him to spend time inside those walls again, to sit in those rooms and speak at those tables, to perform the role of someone who had been wronged and had now been formally rehabilitated. He thought about it seriously, which it deserved. He parked outside his mother's house and sat in the car for 2 minutes, running the question carefully through the available evidence. What he had wanted from the evening record, a name his son could find, he had already set in motion. Eleanor would handle the rest because Eleanor was the kind of person who handled things, and she now had both the information and the motivation to handle this one thoroughly. What he did not want, what became clearer with each quiet mile of the drive, was to go back. Not because he was bitter. Bitterness, he had learned, was expensive and inefficient, but because the life he had built since leaving was his own in a way that the previous one hadn't been, and the people who would need a piece of it going forward were people he chose deliberately, not people who had simply placed themselves in his orbit and assumed his attention was part of the landscape. The front door of his mother's house opened before he reached the porch. Mason was standing in the doorway in his socks and a sweatshirt that was a size too large, holding a toy car in each hand, 2 of the others from the windowsill collection, as if he had been conducting some internal inventory in Wyatt's absence. He looked at his father with that careful, measuring gaze. And then he came down the steps and walked straight into Wyatt's arms without a word. Wyatt held him for a moment. The boy smelled of the particular combination of soap and something warm and slightly sweet that was just the smell of Mason, the way certain smells anchor you to certain truths. He felt the thin weight of him, the specific warmth. "You're late," Mason said, into his shoulder. "I know. I waited up. I know you did." He carried the boy to the car. Mason fell asleep before they had gone 3 blocks. Which was the way it always went, all that bright wakefulness, collapsing the moment the waiting was over. Wyatt drove through the quiet streets and did not think about the gala, or the screens, or the technical documentation, or the name in the changelog, or the man who had arranged a quiet exit for a father with a sick wife and a 4-month-old son. He passed the Meridian Grand on the way out of the district, and the ballroom windows were still blazing gold against the October sky. From the road it looked like every other gathering of important people convinced of their own permanence. He had built the invisible bones of one such gathering's most impressive moment, and not one person inside those lit windows would ever entirely know that, and that was fine. You did not have to be known to have mattered. You did not have to be seen to have built something real. He thought about breakfast, scrambled eggs. Whether the bread had gone stale, he would check in the morning. The silver car sat in his breast pocket, slightly dented on its roof, pressed against the left side of his chest, all the way home. Some things don't need to announce themselves. They just hold steady, in the quiet, and wait for the people who already know what they mean.